So they ended up having you,
Yeah.
but your father ended up passing when you were 2 years old.
Yes.
So you never really got a chance to really know him like that.
Yeah.
Damian Marley finally breaks his silence, and what he just did has left fans speechless. After decades of carrying one of the most legendary names in music, he's made a move no one saw coming. A DNA test, a shocking truth. And then he cut all ties. What happened behind the scenes? Why now? And what does this mean for the Marley legacy going forward?
You know, I would remember seeing people like Shabba Ranks and Tyga and Peter Metro, and I would say I want to be like that. I want to do what they're doing.
As whispers turn into headlines, the music world is still reeling. One thing is clear. This isn't just a family matter. It's a revelation that shakes the roots of everything we thought we knew. Stay tuned. The shadow of a legend. Damian Marley was born into a legacy before he even took his first breath. In 1978, when Cindy Breakspear gave birth to him, the world already knew the name Marley. But what made Damian's arrival especially complicated was the context. His father, Bob Marley, was still married to Rita Marley. Cindy was a beauty queen, Miss World 1976, and their relationship, while passionate, existed in a spotlight many didn't envy. Damian came into the world as the youngest Marley child, but his connection to the family was anything but simple. From early on, Damian lived with a dual identity. On one hand, he was Bob Marley's son, a walking piece of reggae royalty. On the other, he was raised by his mother and stepfather, Tom Tavares Finson, in Stony Hill, a quiet, upscale neighborhood in Kingston. His surroundings were a far cry from Trenchtown, where his father's revolutionary sound was born. Damian once spoke about being aware of those contrasts, racial, social, cultural. "My stepfather and my little brother and sister are white Jamaicans," he once said. It was interesting to grow up around that knowledge. That sense of being between worlds would follow him for decades. He began making music in his teens, forming the Shepherds with other children of famous Jamaican artists. But it was clear early on that Damian wouldn't be riding coattails. He was determined to find his own voice, even if it meant moving at a slower pace than his brothers Ziggy, Stephen, and Julian. And he did. His debut album, Mr. Marley, came out in 1996 and leaned heavily into dancehall and roots reggae. It was a respectable start, but nothing compared to what came next. By the time Welcome to Jamrock dropped in 2005, everything changed. Damian was no longer just Bob's youngest. He was a Grammy-winning artist in his own right, a cultural force, and a lyrical tactician. The title track, with its gritty realism and unfiltered truth about Jamaica's street life, resonated globally. What made it hit harder was that it wasn't coming from someone living in the ghettos. It was coming from someone who understood both sides. Damian's lens was shaped by his unique upbringing. He saw the privilege, but he never turned a blind eye to the pain. Still, no matter how high he climbed, the Marley name always hovered over him. Every performance, every interview, every album release came with the unspoken comparison. Is he living up to his father's legacy? Damian handled it with grace. He rarely leaned on his father's name to promote his work. In fact, he seemed more focused on preserving Bob's message than on capitalizing off it. He once said, "Every one of my father's songs is a lesson." That reverence showed in his music and his actions. But as time passed, observers began noticing something. Damian kept a respectful distance from certain Marley family projects. While he occasionally joined his brothers on stage or supported foundation efforts, he often carved his own path, collaborating with hip-hop artists, producing genre-blending albums, and working on cannabis reform and education initiatives. These weren't just side projects. They were evidence of a man defining himself beyond the name printed on his birth certificate. And still, questions lingered. Damian rarely spoke at length about his personal relationship with Bob. He was only 2 when Bob died, so most of what he knew came through stories, photos, and music. Yet there was always an unspoken understanding that he was part of the legacy. He carried the same last name. He bore the resemblance. He sang with the conviction of someone raised on revolution. But what if the truth was more complicated? What if the connection that shaped his entire public identity was built on something more fragile than anyone imagined? As Damian's music continued to evolve, so did the quiet curiosity around the nature of his bond with Bob Marley. Few dared to ask out loud. But that was about to change. A journey into his roots. Damian Marley never rushed into the spotlight. Unlike some second-generation artists who cling tightly to the fame of their last name, he always seemed to move with a quiet urgency, like a man searching for something deeper. That search became especially clear in 2010, when he joined forces with Nas to create Distant Relatives, an album that would push the boundaries of hip-hop, reggae, and African identity all at once. The collaboration was unexpected at first. Nas, a New York rap legend, and Damian, a Jamaican roots artist. On the surface, they came from different worlds. But the more they spoke, the more they realized they were chasing the same questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? What ties bind us together? The idea behind Distant Relatives was born from those conversations. It wasn't about making a radio hit or capitalizing on star power. It was about bloodlines, about heritage, about trying to trace the spiritual threads that connect continents, cultures, and people. Damian once said in an interview that the project was more than music. It was a conversation between brothers, even though he and Nas weren't related by blood. That irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here was an album titled Distant Relatives, created by two men who felt more like family than some people tied together by genetics. The lyrics talked about slavery, colonization, fatherhood, war, and healing. Damian poured himself into it, not just as a performer, but as a producer, a curator of sound, and a student of history. The album's success wasn't measured in streams alone. It sparked discussions about identity and the African diaspora in a way few records had. They sampled Ethiopian jazz, layered it with Jamaican percussion, and blended it seamlessly with Nas's storytelling. The track Tribal War, featuring Kanan, didn't just name-check conflict, it challenged generations to break cycles. My Generation, with Joss Stone, dared to suggest the youth could be the ones to rewrite the future. For Damian, Distant Relatives wasn't just a musical project, it was a step toward understanding his own past. In a way, it felt like the most personal work of his career. He wasn't just honoring his Jamaican roots. He was reaching further back, beyond the Caribbean, past the slave ships, into Africa's soil and soul. It was a global reclaiming of identity, and he treated it with the weight it deserved. Throughout the press run, Damian often spoke about how little he knew his father personally. He was only 2 years old when Bob passed away. Most of what he'd learned came through the stories of others. That lack of first-hand memory, paired with the magnitude of the legacy he'd inherited, seemed to fuel a hunger. Not just to uphold the Marley name, but to understand it, to understand himself. It wasn't just about being Bob's son. It was about being someone, with or without that connection. And that's what gave Distant Relatives its emotional gravity. It wasn't a vanity project, it was a reckoning. Damian didn't grow up in Trenchtown, but he never distanced himself from struggle. He was fluent in the language of revolution. His music didn't pretend to have all the answers, but it kept asking the right questions. So when fans reflect on that era of his career, it's often with a sense of reverence. That was the moment Damian seemed to step into his full identity, not just as a Marley, but as a man committed to uncovering truth. A truth that wasn't always clean or easy, but necessary. And yet, even in that pursuit of heritage, one truth had yet to be spoken. A truth that had remained buried behind silence, behind loyalty, behind legacy. And when it finally came to light, it would threaten to upend everything he thought he knew. Whispers behind closed doors. For years, the Marley name stood as a monument, unshakable, revered, global. And yet, within the walls of that legacy, not everything was as unified as the public believed. Whispers had always followed Damian, subtle questions no one dared to ask aloud. Raised mostly by his mother and stepfather, seen less frequently at family events than some of his half-siblings, Damian always carried himself with a mix of pride and quiet distance. He was respectful, loyal, but never overly attached to the machine that managed the Marley brand. Insiders noticed. At charity concerts tied to the estate, Damian's name was sometimes missing from the lineups. When documentaries or interviews were organized around Bob's life, Damian occasionally appeared, but never lingered. In fact, some fans pointed out how often he carved his own lane. Whether it was with Nas, Mick Jagger, or his own independent label, Damian seemed most at home when he was miles away from the inner workings of the Marley Empire. This wasn't bitterness. It wasn't rebellion. It felt more like restraint, like someone carrying a burden no one else could see. People close to the family said that Damian had long been asking quiet questions, not out of disrespect, but out of personal curiosity. Raised away from Trenchtown, surrounded by a different class and culture, he experienced the Marley mythos through a filtered lens. For the public, Bob was a godlike figure, but for Damian, that god had always been out of reach. And the more he tried to piece together his place in the family story, the more elusive the answers became. There were moments in interviews, rare, blink and you miss them moments, where Damian hinted at uncertainty. He once told a journalist that growing up with his stepfather, Tom Tavares Finson, shaped him in ways most people didn't realize. "He was a real influence in my life," Damian said. "He was there every day. He taught me things no one else could." It was a beautiful sentiment, but also a subtle reminder that the man most absent in his life was the one everyone expected him to emulate. Even in his music, the references to Bob were rare. While his brothers often performed covers of their father's classics or leaned heavily into the reggae image that made Bob famous, Damian did something different. He blurred the lines, infusing hip-hop, experimenting with Middle Eastern sounds, collaborating with politically active rappers, pushing toward global narratives rather than family mythologies. The message was clear, even if unspoken. Damian respected where he came from, but he wasn't going to let it define him completely. Pushing toward global narratives rather than family mythologies. The message was clear, even if unspoken. Damian respected where he came from, but he wasn't going to let it define him completely. And then came the rumors. It started quietly. A former associate of the family mentioned in a podcast that Damian had once brought up questions about his biological roots. Nothing concrete, no scandal, just a strange comment passed off as idle curiosity. But then a music journalist dug up a curious pattern. Damian had been seen less and less at family events over the past 5 years. He'd skipped anniversary celebrations, legacy tours, and award shows honoring his father. One tabloid even claimed he turned down an invitation to speak at a Marley Foundation tribute because he felt disconnected from the narrative. None of this was confirmed. No one in the Marley circle was speaking on record, but the silences were starting to get louder. And as more fans began to revisit old interviews, lyrics, and decisions Damian had made over the years, the questions gained weight. Why had he always walked a different path? Why had he so carefully avoided being labeled just Bob Marley's son? And why did it feel more than ever like Damian was preparing to say something that would shake the very core of what people believed? Whatever was coming, it wasn't going to be a footnote. It was going to be something seismic. Something that, if true, wouldn't just change how we see Damian Marley. It would change how we see the entire legacy. Damian breaks silence. The silence ended without warning. On a quiet morning in early 2025, Damian Marley posted a single statement to his official website. No press conference, no interviews, no music drop. Just one sentence, calm but unmistakable. Sometimes the truth comes late, but it still comes. And with that, the speculation erupted into something far more real. According to reports that followed, Damian had recently undergone a private DNA test, initiated quietly, without public attention, and reportedly without the Marley estate's knowledge. What sparked it? That part remains unclear. Some close to him say it was curiosity that had simmered since his teens. Others claim it was a final attempt to answer lingering questions about a bloodline that never quite felt complete. Whatever the reason, the results, according to sources, delivered something he never expected. The reports allege that Damian's DNA showed no biological link to Bob Marley. For a man who had spent his entire life navigating that name, that shadow, that legacy. The revelation hit like a wrecking ball. He didn't confirm or deny the reports directly, but what he did next spoke louder than any denial could. Damian pulled out of all remaining Marley-branded projects for the year, including a global tour celebrating Bob's 80th birthday. His team issued a second statement weeks later, saying he would be redefining his path moving forward, independent of inherited titles or assumed history. It was a move that stunned fans and insiders alike. Headlines lit up with disbelief. Damian Marley finally breaks silence and cuts all ties after DNA test reveals shocking truth. It sounded like fiction, but the fallout was very real. He stopped using the Marley estate's promotional material. He unfollowed official Marley channels on social media. And in a particularly bold move, he canceled plans to remaster his early album Mr. Marley, which had originally been pitched as a tribute to his father's sound. These weren't emotional reactions. They were calculated, intentional steps away from the identity the world had long accepted. "This changes everything," one music journalist tweeted the day after the story broke. And it did. It wasn't just about Damian. It called into question the narrative the world had embraced for decades. If one of Bob's acknowledged children turned out not to be his by blood, what did that mean for the legacy as a whole? For the estate? For the idea of Marley as a family more than a brand? Fans were divided. Some demanded more proof, more clarity, more confirmation. Others expressed heartbreak, not because Damian might not be Bob's biological son, but because the lie had lasted so long. A few went deeper, suggesting that maybe it wasn't a lie at all. Maybe Bob himself never knew. Or maybe, as some have speculated, this was never about biology. It was about being chosen, loved, and accepted, regardless of genetics. And yet, Damian's decision to cut ties sent a clear message. Whether or not Bob knew, Damian needed answers. And the answers he found pushed him towards something most people never dare to do: publicly break away from a legacy that built your name. This wasn't a publicity stunt. There was no new album to sell, no documentary to promote. Just a quiet, deliberate shift. A man reclaiming his identity, not as a son of a legend, but as a man who had questions, found answers, and decided that truth, however uncomfortable, was more important than image. As of now, the Marley estate has not responded. Cindy Breakspear has remained silent. And Damian? He's still touring, still recording, still standing on his own. But something has changed. The story everyone thought they knew has cracked wide open, and the question no one ever thought to ask, what if he was never Bob's son to begin with, is now impossible to ignore. Fallout and family silence. After the revelation, there was no official denial. No press statement from the Marley estate, no televised interview with the family, just silence. And that silence said more than any words could. In the weeks following the alleged DNA test revelation, the music world entered an odd state of limbo. Damian Marley's withdrawal from Marley-branded projects wasn't temporary. It appeared permanent. Venues quietly removed his name from Bob Marley tribute concerts. Promotional material was edited without explanation. Even merchandise that once featured Damian's image beside his siblings suddenly vanished from store shelves and online platforms. Within the Marley family, insiders say the mood was tense. Some relatives, especially those close to Rita Marley, reportedly viewed Damian's decision as a betrayal. They believed that regardless of DNA, Bob had accepted him. That made him a Marley in every way that mattered. Others remained neutral, stunned by the news, but unwilling to take sides. A few, though, expressed private support. "He deserves to know who he is," one anonymous family associate told a journalist, "whether the world understands or not." Cindy Breakspear, Damian's mother, was notably absent from the conversation. Once a highly visible figure who spoke openly about her past with Bob, she went silent. Friends said she was shaken, not only by the test results, but by the emotional toll it seemed to take on her son. Damian had reportedly asked her direct questions in the lead-up to the test. And while details of those conversations remain private, it's clear that something shifted between them in the aftermath. Fans responded in waves. Some called for compassion, saying Damian's identity crisis must be unimaginable, especially under the weight of global scrutiny. Others accused him of dishonoring Bob's legacy by publicizing something that could have been kept private. A smaller but growing group praised him for doing what most people would never dare, choosing personal truth over inherited mythology. And then there was the press. Journalists scrambled to dig up anything they could. Old interviews were rewatched, old articles dissected. One surfaced clip from a mid-2000s press tour showed Damian being asked how he coped with being Bob Marley's son. His answer at the time was short and direct. "I live my truth. I don't pretend." At the time, the remark felt cryptic. Now it sounded prophetic. Despite the media frenzy, Damian didn't retreat from the public eye. He continued to tour, now under his full name only. No mention of Junior. Gong He stopped performing covers of Bob's songs and removed them from his set list entirely. At one show, when a fan shouted a request for "Could You Be Loved?", Damian simply shook his head and said, "That's not my song." There were other changes, too. At recent events, his visuals shifted from Pan-African flags and Marley-themed backdrops to more abstract imagery, roots growing through concrete, shadows reaching for light, masks breaking open. Subtle, but telling. People close to him say he's more focused than ever. One band member described his mood as lighter, strangely, like a weight's been lifted, even if it came at a cost. That cost, it seems, is the legacy that once lifted him. And now, it's something he's chosen to walk away from. Yet for all the distance Damian has put between himself and the Marley name, the questions haven't stopped. Was the DNA test definitive? Will the estate ever respond? Does this mean Damian plans to change his name? For now, those answers remain out of reach. What's clear is that the silence, from the estate, from his mother, from the legacy machine itself, is deliberate. It's the kind of silence that follows a rupture, a fracture that can't be undone. And as fans and critics alike try to make sense of what it all means, Damian moves forward. Not as a son of reggae royalty, but as a man unburdened, finally perhaps, entirely himself. What it all means now. In the end, Damian Marley didn't give the world a grand explanation. He didn't sit down with a major network or pen a tell-all memoir. He simply kept moving forward, on his own terms, in his own time. And that, perhaps, was the final message. Whether the DNA test results are ever confirmed by official sources hardly seems to matter anymore. What matters is that something shifted. A son who was once the quiet torchbearer of a global icon chose to step away from the very name that shaped his career. And he did it not with bitterness or spectacle, but with intention. His recent interviews, few and far between, hint at a man coming to peace with the ambiguity. He talks more now about roots in a broader sense, less about family, more about the search for spiritual alignment. The themes of distant relatives ring louder in hindsight. Identity, ancestry, disconnection, and the mystery of where we truly come from. The world may still refer to him as a Marley, but Damian no longer seems bound by that name. He's performing under Damian Robert now in some circles. Whether that becomes permanent or symbolic is anyone's guess. What's certain is that his music hasn't lost its purpose. If anything, it sounds freer. Fans are still divided. Some continue to question the decision. Others say it was long overdue. But there's one feeling that quietly connects them all. This story doesn't feel like a scandal. It feels like a man finding out something he wasn't prepared for, and choosing to live with that truth, rather than hide from it. As for the Marley legacy, it remains intact but altered. The legend of Bob Marley is bigger than any one descendant. But Damian's departure forces a question the public rarely asks. How much of legacy is blood, and how much is belief? The silence may stretch on. No formal statement may ever come. But in a way, that's fitting, because this was never about drama. It was about a man standing in the quiet storm of his own identity, and finally, choosing to walk through it, alone. Could distant relatives have been Damian's way of searching for a truth he already suspected, and were the clues hiding in plain sight all along?